cleanliness, redefining purity. And that's important for today's lesson because the very first thing we're going to see here in Mark chapter 7 and verse 24 is Jesus goes up and he departs from there, from where he's talking with the Pharisees, and he goes to the region of Tyre. Why is this significant? What is significant about the region or city of Tyre? Was it a Jewish or a Gentile city? It was a predominantly Gentile city. So Jesus is leaving the land of the Jews and going to a predominantly Gentile area. And he enters the house and did not want anyone to know, but he could not escape notice. Instead, immediately, there's our word again, after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. And the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she was asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And so really what we need to do is ask the question that's on the slide right there. Who comes to Jesus in Mark 7 and 8? What kind of people come to Jesus? Obviously the Syrophoenician woman. I spoiled that one. But
just a quick question. Syrophoenician is Greek, right?
Not inherently. It would have been tied to Syro and Phoenician, I would think, would some level of Syria or Phoenicia. There is some, this is geeking out a little bit if I remember correctly, some believe that there is a tie between Greece and the Phoenicians, the Greece and maybe Philistines as well, in terms of travel and some genetic stuff. If I'm remembering correctly, I may not be remembering correctly, so maybe I shouldn't say that, but
I don't think because I think it's Syrophoenician.
that's what I was saying, Syro-Phoenicia. But there is also a tie genetically in terms of, like, you go back to like 15, 16, 1700, 1800 BC. Like really long back there. Some believe there may be a tie, but I'm kind of going off of something I read.
I didn't mean to derail that. Syrophoenician is not a term we use.
No, it's not. So like what Kevin is saying, Syro, Phoenician, Syria, Phoenician, they're Gentile. That's the important thing for us to keep in mind here. Whether it's Greek or tied to the Greek, or whether they're Syrian or Phoenician, whatever the case is, the point I think for us to understand here in this text is that this person is a Gentile. That Jesus has left the realm of the Jews and he has gone to Gentile territory. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Why did you even go in his house and meet with them?
Yeah.
They were a Gentile.
Yeah.
So that was sticking with that custom. You don't mix like that.
No.
Even after Jesus died.
Yeah. That was a real big sticking point in the early church, and I'm using that very generically, is what to do with the Gentiles. Like if you look at the book of Acts, for example, the first quarter of the book of Acts is about the gospel to the Jews. And as you pointed out, like when Cornelius and his house obey the gospel, they're like, what in the world do we do? Like even Paul has to write a couple of letters, Galatians, for example, saying, guys, the old law's dead. Colossians, there's some who believe in the book of Colossians, which we've been looking at in our worship period, that some Judaizing teachers were going around and saying you have to keep the old law. And so this idea of the Jew and the Greek relationship, what's going on? Honestly, just to spoil the surprise here, when we get to the book of Romans, there's a good reason to believe the reason Paul writes the book of Romans is to deal with the Jew and Greek problem. It was something that was not easily overcome because they had generations, they had century, they had really 2,000 years almost of we're different. And they had to work past those differences. And as we know from even maybe our own country's history, working past racial problems can be a bit of a challenge at times. And that's what they're kind of wrestling with here. And the Jesus movement in the Gospels, but also the Jesus movement, the church in the book of Acts. I'm glad you brought that up. And so Jesus has gone to this region of Tyre. It's a Gentile woman, Syrophoenician, and she goes, hey, please help my daughter. My daughter is hurting. My daughter has a demon. And what does Jesus do? He heals her, but what does he say first? Verse 27.
Let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread, throw it to the dogs. Continue?
You can go continue. We're going to maybe we may wrestle a little bit with verse 27 because I want to see what you guys say because I am struggling with verse 27, what to make of it.
I have an opinion.
Yeah.
But she answered him, yes, Lord, that even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs.
Yeah.
And he said to her, for this statement you may go your way. The demon has left you.
Yeah.
So, it's going to be a question, but here's what I think he means by 27. That statement there is that he's referred to himself as the bread of life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the children, I think, are Jewish people. And he's saying, why would you give the bread to Gentiles over Jews first? And then she counters with, but in that metaphorical comparison,
Yeah.
even the dogs have the crumbs.
Yeah.
He's telling her there, why should I cast the demon out?
Yeah.
You're not a
Yeah.
faith. And it's referred to as a dog.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a Gentile. But she counters said, but even the dogs still eat of the crumbs.
Yeah.
And I think it was a statement for effect there to show that the gospel is for everyone.
Yeah.
Not just the
And I think that last statement gets at the heart of what we're going to see today, that the gospel is for everyone. Because just to spoil the surprise for what we're going to see today, we see the healing of this Gentile woman's daughter in verse 24 through 30. Jesus continued to do some miracles in verse 31 through 37 in that same region, in that same area. It's a predominantly Gentile area. And then in chapter 8, we're going to see Jesus feed 4,000 people. Most believe that these three stories, these three accounts, all happen in Gentile territory. So what you just said is correct, I think, in the sense that Jesus is showing the universality of his message and his mission.
Does that tie in then with, I'm not sure it's found, but I'm not a Christ where it is the power of God and salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Does that tie together that it was also first to the Jews?
Potentially, yeah. And I think there's a good reason to kind of tie that. You look at the early church, first 9 chapters of Acts is the gospel to the Jews. It's not until Acts 10 you see the gospel go to the Gentiles. So you see a little bit of that. And there's a reason, there's some logic behind it. I mean, the Jews had been expecting this Messiah to come from their family, their people, for 2,000 years by this point. Almost maybe even 2,100 years, 2,200 years, depending on the chronology of the Old Testament. And now, finally, that Messiah has come. And so, okay, now it's time for us to share it among our people and then share it to the Jews. Kevin, I see your hand.
I think I'm mostly pretty much on the same page as Rick was saying, but add how this is teaching here, I guess. Like, he has the advantage of knowing art.
Mm-hmm.
And so his first response is really more what any, quote, good Jewish person.
Yeah.
Like, that was what I think what expected to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
power field, then the Jews would have come back and said, why did you kill it?
Yeah.
Gentiles.
Yeah.
And it would have created a different, the teaching would have been a different period. Versus this, Jesus gives the Jewish response that would have been acceptable.
Yeah.
And then make this profound.
Yeah, I think a lot of things are, yeah, Rick.
Yeah, just, Kevin and I are kind of on the same wavelength there, that comparison to the dog under the table still has a hope
Yeah.
of the crumb.
Yeah.
That's kind of what she's saying, is that, look, and her heart, Jesus looked into her heart.
And just kind of taking to kind of build off of Kevin's point, just what he said a moment ago, and then we're going to go to you, Todd. One of the themes we've started to see in the last couple of chapters of Mark's gospel is Jesus' compassion for people. And here you do see Jesus' compassion for her, but is also in some sense a test of her faith. And I think you guys are hitting on the same ideas that I kind of have here in the text. It is that hard saying of Jesus, because we read verse 27 and it's like, what in the world is Jesus saying? But I think if you look at and zoom out and kind of think about Jesus' approach and the early church's approach to spreading the gospel Jew first and then to the Greek, I think you guys are hitting on some really good thoughts to try to understand what is often a very challenging verse to deal with.
Also a teaching moment for the disciples.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's setting things up.
Yeah. Setting things up for them later down the road. Todd, what's going on in your mind?
So, it sounds like on the surface that Jesus contradicts himself.
Mm-hmm.
Because he says, hey, I am here for the children of Israel first.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what are you doing in Tyre?
Yeah. It's a fair point.
I mean,
Yeah.
and he says that. So, I think I'm signing on the consensus here that the whole point of this dialogue that he's having with this woman is to cry out a confession of faith.
From a Gentile. And even kind of, okay, remember who Mark is probably, most believe Mark is writing to a predominantly Roman audience. The Roman church is going to be probably made up of more Gentiles. And so when Mark can, he's going to highlight the faith of Gentiles. And really what you see in this series of chapters, Mark 6, Mark 7, and Mark 8, is the contrast between how these Jews, the Pharisees, for example, are receiving or responding to Jesus. They're hardening their hearts to Jesus. They don't have the faith that they can, and even sometimes we're going to find out today, the disciples don't have the faith they need to have. And the Gentiles who seem to get it. It's very interesting to think about. Yeah, Gina.
I love this woman's humble heart. That she doesn't get offended. She doesn't get haughty because you just called me a dog. Whatever. She just has such a humble heart in the way that she
Yeah.
received that. It's just absolutely beautiful. And yet,
Yeah.
I even think, even myself, if you see something, somebody pointed out something wrong, how easy it is to fuck up, offended by that.
Yeah.
She didn't. And I
Yeah.
thought that's such a beautiful lesson for us to
Yeah.
learn. God admonished us to keep that heart.
Yeah.
And I believe the Jews looked at dogs as clean.
Yeah.
That's why the reference, I think.
Yeah. They're not exactly walking around with Shaggy in their front house. I mean, they're not walking around with a nice little golden doodle, to take care of. The dogs were unclean. Dogs were scavenger. They kind of view dogs in most situations as kind of like on the level of maybe how we would view a coyote today. There were obviously exceptions. Like in Nehemiah's day, the Persians loved dogs. And they've actually uncovered portions of Nehemiah's wall. And the reason they're pretty confident it's the wall that Nehemiah built is there's dog bones in it. And the speculation among archaeologists is, when they're trying to fill in, they're just taking whatever they can find. And there was a dead dog. We're going to put a dead dog into the dirt and whatever. So that's one of the reasons they believe that wall they found over in Jerusalem dates to the time of Nehemiah is the presence of dog bones. So you see in the Jews who generally don't like dogs, Persians did, maybe some other Gentile nations did, but the Jews kind of viewed them as scavengers, kind of like coyotes today. And she kind of, in this great act of humility, this great comment that shows her heart. And Jesus responds to that there in the text. Verse 29, because of that, you must go. The demon has left her daughter. Her daughter is healed. She goes back home and finds out that the daughter is fine and the demon was gone. And so what we're about to see really here in this chapter, this is what I find really, really interesting. There in verse 27, you don't give the scraps to the dogs. What is Jesus about to do in Mark chapter 8? He's not about to give scraps. He's about to have a feast in Gentile territory. So it's an interesting contrast here in the text. And so after leaving the region of Tyre, he went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee through the region of the Decapolis, and they brought to him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking and begged Jesus to lay his hand on him. And so he took him away from the crowd, and after putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue. This is just weird to think about, just for us today. Putting hands in people's ears and in their mouth is just, for me, weird to think about. I don't know if I'm the only one here, but that's what Jesus does here in the text. Looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be open. And immediately his ears were open, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak clearly, and he ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more they proclaimed it. And they were extremely astonished and said, he has done everything well. Even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Anything jump out to you about that story, that account there in Mark chapter 7 at the very end? Yeah.
Funny that they come to him and they know that he has all this power and they're willing to use the power, but they're not willing to heed what he tells them, which I think is kind of strange. Don't tell anybody. So excited they can't help it.
Yeah, and that's really kind of one of the interesting things in the Gospels is, like, if you open up a commentary, they're going to call it the Messianic secret. And you have these moments in the Gospels where Jesus says, don't tell anybody, and the person doesn't. And you have moments where Jesus tells the person, don't tell anybody, and they do. And you have moments where Jesus heals somebody, and he says, go and proclaim it. There's all these, like, why and what, and there's a lot of things you can think about here when you look at the Gospels, especially when Jesus says, don't tell anyone, and they go tell what's going on. And the kind of where I'm at on that is that Jesus doesn't want people proclaiming who he is unless they really grasp who he is. Because he's not just a magician. He's not just a miracle worker. Those miracles were designed to point them to something else. And so unless you grasp who Jesus really is, he doesn't want you proclaiming. And we're going to see a little bit of that in the next chapter, in Mark chapter 8. Yeah, Rick.
And that's why, he sighed, okay, and he looked at it.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me says he was really hoping to come to him to hear his teaching.
Yeah.
Instead, it was showing,
Yeah.
can you do this thing?
Yeah. Yeah. Can heal me, take care of me, fix me. Yeah.
Kind of plays off of what you're saying, that even though he asked us not to do that, he knows our nature. He knows us as human beings. He knows that if you tell them not to do it, they're gonna do it.
Yeah.
But he knows our nature.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
our nature, and that's the sign.
Yeah.
I know you guys are gonna do this, even when I tell you not to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, like I'll give a quick story. So there's a specific clothing brand that I got hooked on a couple of years ago. And even to the point where I may be on a first name basis with the guys there. I go in a year and a half ago, and I'm talking with the guy, and I've been eyeing the specific article of clothing they sold for like a year and a half at that time. And I'm talking with him, and he's like, here, comes out and gives me a 50% off coupon. He goes, next time you're in, just whenever you want to buy it, come get it. I don't know what the store policy is, but the next time I went in, I found out he was unemployed. And I started asking around gently. I was like, what happened? He's like, yeah, we got a new manager. I don't know what happened, but I wonder if maybe somebody got in trouble because they weren't supposed to do that. Nevertheless, what did I do when I got home to this point while I'm telling this story? I went home and told my parents, like, hey, look what I got this and whatnot. We have a tendency, to your point, of telling people things that probably should be kept secret. I think more frequently call that gossip, maybe, but Jesus doesn't want them going around telling people yet. One of the other things I see here as he's dealing with this, healing this man, is the difference in how Jesus does this. Like, Jesus sometimes touches, Jesus sometimes speaks, Jesus sometimes does processes. Like, every healing is different, and that's just curious to me. I don't know if it's curious to you. Jesus has his way of healing each person differently. Anyways, any final thoughts on Mark chapter 7? Go in Mark chapter 8. In those days, chapter 8 and verse 1, there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. And he called the disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they've already stayed with me 3 days, and they have nothing to eat. So how is this feeding, before we get into the text and dig into the text, how is this feeding here in Mark chapter 8 similar to, or maybe even different than, the feeding we saw a week or so ago in Mark chapter 6? What are the differences? What are the similarities? What do you guys notice there in the text? Yeah. He had compassion on the crowd, largely Jewish crowd. He had compassion on the crowd in what is most likely a Gentile area. He had compassion. Jesus' compassion is one of the things we are seeing. He is in Gentile territory. He is healing Gentiles. He cares about them. What else do you guys see there? Yeah.
Well, in the first story of feeding the crowd, his disciples came to him and said, hey, can we just kind of stop a little early so we can go and get some food? And,
Yeah.
in this case, I kind of feel like second time around, he was hoping that after the first of him feeding a large crowd, I kind of feel like he was hoping that his disciples kind of got this, kind of known that
Yeah.
you can feed him, but he had compassion on him, and he kind of instigated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an interesting perception as you look at verses 2 and 3. His compassion, they've been with me for 3 days. If I send them home hungry, they're going to collapse. They're going to faint on the way. They've come a long distance. Almost like he's wanting the disciples to say, hey, Jesus, we know you have the power to feed multitude in the wilderness. You have the power to multiply bread. You are the Son of God. They're like basing everything off of what they've seen in Mark chapter 6 when the feeding of the 5,000, what they've learned, and now they're applying it into practice here. But how do they respond here in Mark chapter 7? Or Mark chapter 8, excuse me.
How can one bread in this
Yeah.
desolate place?
Yeah.
Hadn't they already seen other
That's kind of the point right there. Like, they're not putting two and two together. And they what they should have done based on Mark chapter 6, and this is what I think you're getting at, Jesus' compassion, multitude in the wilderness. Jesus, we know you're the God. We know you have the power to feed multitudes. We know that's what you did for our family 1,500 years ago with Moses in the wilderness. We know that's what you did a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago, whatever it was. We know you can do it again. Instead, they go, Jesus, where's the Safeway? Where's the QFC? Where's the Whole Foods? Where's the grocery store? We can't find food for this many people in the middle of nowhere. And at this point, this is me reading into the text. I admit that. You can almost kind of hear Jesus sigh, like, they're not getting it. Yeah. 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 They're slow learners. Does anybody know anyone that is a slow learner today? Like you've got to fail like 103 times before you go, it's probably not smart to do X, Y, Z. Yeah, they were slow learners. I'm glad you brought up Mark 6:52 because what do we see in the next section of Scripture as the Pharisees came and they began to argue with him, demanding a sign from heaven to test him. That's the exact same language the Old Testament used to describe Israel's apostasy in the wilderness, and now the religious leaders are coming to Jesus and saying, we're going to test you. We don't believe you're the Messiah. It's the same language. The faithlessness of the multitude in the wilderness is repeated by the faithlessness of the Pharisees. And Jesus looks at the disciples in verse 15. Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And in verse 16 and 17, it shows us they don't get it. Verse 21, don't you understand yet? I fed a multitude twice and you're not picking up what I'm putting down. What are the parallels do you see between these two feedings? Compassion. What else? Their hardness of heart. What else? How much do they start with in both feedings? Small amount, not much. What do they end up with? Lots of leftovers. I've done my fair share of cooking and eating. Generally speaking, when you cook 5 pounds of food and you feed a multitude, you do not end up with 50 pounds of food. Generally speaking. It's showing us here God's power, Jesus' power to feed the multitude. It's showing us here, I think, in the text, going back to what we saw in the last chapter with the Gentile mother, that the Gentiles were not leftovers. That Jesus here in the wilderness is eating a meal with Gentiles. And yet, despite these miracles that Jesus is working in Jewish territory, in Gentile territories, the Pharisees don't get it. The disciples don't get it. People don't understand what in the world is going on. And we've already spoiled this question a minute ago. But it's important to understand that people haven't changed much. 1,500 years have progressed. The entire Old Testament has been written. And yet the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, the people who should have seen what Jesus is doing and what he's saying, this is the guy we've been waiting for, don't really get it. And so often, as we were kind of hinting around and dancing around last week, when it comes to our tradition, so often we're just like the Pharisees. We just don't get it. That the Gentiles were not scraps, they're not given scraps, they are part of God's family. Any final thoughts before we move on to the next section there in Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 22, and try to put a bow on some things that Jesus is going to tell us? Yeah. 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 And you bring up a great point there about the importance of reminders. You know, for Old Testament Israel, what did they have as a reminder for what God had done for them? Yeah, they had the Sabbath. They had also the Passover. And in fact, if you look at Old Testament history, in those books that we kind of observe the Passover with sometimes, one of the things we see and one of the things we discover is that the Jewish people didn't exactly have in the Old Testament the greatest track record of remembering and observing the Passover. And I can't help but wonder if maybe one of the reasons they fell away so fast is because they failed to stop and remember. And in fact, Judges chapter 2 tells us that after the generation of Joshua, there arose a generation that did not know, that did not remember God and all the things that God had done for them. And what do we see in the book of Judges? Did what was right in their own eyes. It's a rated R version of a society that has rejected God. And so we see a lot of things going on here in terms of getting it and not getting it. In fact, one of the things we're going to see here in just a moment is the guy who gets it, but not quite, in Peter. And we're going to dig into that. So the Pharisees ask for a sign. They're testing Jesus. They're acting just like their forefathers 1,500 years earlier. And then we get to Mark chapter 8 and verse 22, where Jesus comes to Bethsaida, and they brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village, and spitting on his eyes, kind of going back to Mark chapter 7, where there's a little bit of a process type of thing, where it's not just Jesus speaking or not just Jesus touching, there's a process. He spits on his eyes and lays his hands on him and says, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking." I don't think this was Ince from Lord of the Rings. Again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes, and the man looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And then he sent him home, saying, "Don't even go to the village." Anything jump out to you about healing of the blind man? Yeah. Yeah. That it strikes me as like, what's Jesus doing here? Why is it partial? Why is it not immediately? I mean, we've been reading Mark. We're halfway through the book of Mark by this point. And we're kind of accustomed as readers to seeing, and Jesus spoke, Jesus touched, Jesus did something, and immediately. And here at the halfway point, it's not immediate. What's going on? It's puzzling. Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting perspective. That is a very interesting perspective, that maybe the blind man needed a little bit of help to build his faith to the point that he believed that Jesus could do it. Anyways, we're going to get to verse 27 here. Verse 27. And really, I think this is almost like the turning point in the gospel. Like if you were to imagine, I kind of believe Mark is kind of probably written in 3 acts. Like a book, a story has 3 different acts. A-C-T-S, I think it's... Anyways, 3 acts. This is almost, if you were to divide it into 2 parts. We have gotten to the climax. We have gotten to the turning point. Acts chapter 8 verse 27. If you're divided into 2 parts, if that's the way you like to divide Mark's narrative, this is the turning point. Here in Mark chapter 8, what does Peter understand about Jesus? And what does he miss? What does Peter understand? Yeah, Craig?
Well, he gets that he's the Son of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
What he's missing is he's not going to be a physical king.
Yeah.
And you can't put that together.
Yeah, verse 28. You know, and this is interesting on so many levels. So go back to Mark chapter 6 real quickly. Mark chapter 6, where John the Baptist is beheaded, and Herod calls all these people in and says, "I hear something about Jesus. What's going on?" And some people are saying, he's Elijah. He's the prophets. Okay? When Jesus asked this question of his disciples, there in Mark chapter 8, what do they say?
John the Baptist, Elijah.
Is it Elijah? Like, the crowds, the people are struggling to reconcile what they see Jesus doing and who he really is and what's going on. And so he says, that's what the people say, but who do you say? And Peter, always the one with an open mouth, says, you are the Christ, the Son of God. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. And then Jesus says, don't tell me. This is a light bulb moment for Peter. He gets it. He understands that Jesus is the Messiah. Why would he say, shut up? Could it be? Jesus understands, as Craig said a moment ago. Jesus knows that, yes, he is the Messiah, but not the kind of Messiah they're looking for. Because so many Jews in the first century, when they heard the word Messiah, what were they thinking of? As Craig pointed out, a king who's going to come along and he's going to overthrow the Romans. And Jesus is like, yes, I am the Messiah, but not the kind of Messiah you're looking for. They get it, and not quite.
Not the Messiah.
Yeah, yeah.
Wasn't that like why that was blasphemy to be called son, to call yourself the Son of God, and that was when he went for the courts, I can't think.
Yeah, yeah.
That they were saying flat out that, and that's why they killed him, or the basis of their killing him was that blasphemy.
Yeah, so what you're catching on, verse 29, you are the Messiah, strictly warned them. And then he began, verse 31, to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed and rise after 3 days. Jesus is connecting the Messiah not with a victorious overthrow of the Romans. He is connecting the Messiah not only with the Son of Man figure from Daniel chapter 7, but with suffering and death and sacrifice. And that's about to turn their world upside down. In fact, this is just so important. So the rest of Mark's gospel, we're going to a section, I think it's Mark 8 through Mark 11 or so, where Jesus is going to give 3 predictions of his death. Each of those predictions, they're in Mark chapter 8 through 11. There's one in 8, there's one in 9, and there is one in chapter 10. So 8, 9, and 10. It's going to be proclamation of his death, proclamation of his resurrection, and teaching on discipleship in some form or fashion. What does it really mean to be a disciple of Jesus? What does it really mean to follow Jesus on the way? And another thing you often see in these proclamations of Jesus' sacrifice is also a failure on the part of the disciples. So we're going to look at one example today. We may be looking at another example in the next couple of weeks, over the next couple of weeks. So pay attention to the narrative as we're working through the fall and the cost and the proclamation of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and the disciples and how they respond to that message. Because they hear that message proclaimed in verse 31, and Jesus in verse 32 is speaking openly about this. He's not backing down. I'm going to die. I'm going to sacrifice my life. I am going to rise from the dead. He keeps saying it. And Peter, once again, always with the open mouth, pulls Jesus aside in verse 32 and began to rebuke him. And turning around, looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but humans' concerns." Peter, in one sense, is siding with Satan. And it's time for Peter to take his place as a disciple. Not beside Jesus, not in front of Jesus, but behind Jesus.
Well, also think about what just happened. So when Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" He said, "You're the Christ, the Messiah." Okay.
Yeah.
And by Jesus saying, tell no one, he's confirming it, but he don't want him to say anything. because he's got the wrong idea of what a
Yeah.
Messiah is,
Yeah.
the Messiah would do.
Yeah.
And then for Jesus to say, well, I'm gonna suffer and die, well now, here comes Peter again, going, wait a minute, I thought I had it. How
Yeah.
can you be the Messiah and die?
Yeah.
And that's what's going on here.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you can't die.
No.
Because you just told me you're the Messiah.
Yeah. Yeah. You just said you're a Messiah. You can't die because you're going to lead us on a victorious insurrection and overthrow the Romans, and we're going to be a free nation once again.
Okay. And then Jesus kind of gives him the answer.
Yeah.
Setting your mind on things of man and not of God.
And he goes, oh, by the way, Peter, and this is so important as we wrap up class today, there in chapter 34 through 38, to the end of the chapter, he talks about what it really means to follow Jesus. And so what does Jesus teach the disciples and us about following him? Keep in mind what's going on in the context. That Jesus has just proclaimed and confirmed that he is in fact the Messiah. He has proclaimed and confirmed what it means for the Messiah, Jesus to be the Messiah, that involves death, burial, and resurrection. So what does that mean for his disciples? Yeah, Gina.
Well, from what he's saying here, is that if you're going to come after me, you will suffer.
Yeah.
It's going to cost
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
But the reward later on is going to be worth it.
Yeah. If the master suffered, the students will suffer too. And so if you want to follow me on this road of discipleship, then it is a one-way road, a one-way trip that always leads to death. And whoever wants to save your life, you're going to end up losing it. And those of you who are willing to lose your life, who are willing to die because that's what following Jesus is all about, will save it. In verse 36, I think he speaks particularly to those of us who live in the West. For what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life or lose his soul? What can anyone give in exchange for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man, that Daniel 7 figure who's going to reign on high, who Jesus has already connected to being the Messiah just a few verses earlier, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father and with the holy angels. If you want Jesus to say, well done, my good and faithful servant, then you need to be willing to go on that cross, that way to the cross with Jesus. Any final thoughts, comments, or questions all the way to the end of Mark chapter 8? We will pick up in Mark chapter 9 next week. I'll try to have questions out Thursday, and for those of you who come on the Wednesday night class, I'll have questions hopefully tomorrow. Today's Sunday, so tomorrow night we'll have questions for Sunday. On that note, class dismissed.